Okay, as we'll get started then. Thank you very much for joining us today on this BCC Global Trade webinar, where the subject matter is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. We have two guests with us today. Joining us and bringing their expertise to play in this conversation that I hope we can have around this subject. I should ask that you use the Q&A function at the foot of your screen to raise any questions that you may have on the subject, either right now or as we go through the next 40, 50 minutes or thereabouts. And we'll come to as many of those questions as we can. My name's Liam Smith. I'm Director of Trade Facilitation at the British Chambers of Commerce and also Director of Chamber Customs, or Customs Brokerage Training and Advisory Service. And I'm joined today by Graham Zebedee, who is the Chief Negotiator on behalf of UK Government on the CPTPP and also leads the Trade Policy Group at the Department of International Trade, and has had a really interesting, I imagine, last couple of years leading the continuity agreement negotiations and those bilaterals that we already have in place. Graham comes to DIT having been former ambassador to the Democratic Republic of Congo, having earned his stripes, I think, in Kabul, Afghanistan, and prior to that in a number of other roles within the civil service that have no doubt equipped him very well to be able to do this current task, having delivered the UK-Japan partnership agreement last year. So thank you very much for joining us today, Graham. Welcome to you. We're also joined by Dr. Anna Yarevska, who is an expert, a consultant on trade and borders, and also, apart from all of the other roles that she carries out in being called as an expert by UK Parliament very regularly and to commentate in the press, is an advisor to the British Chambers of Commerce and also an associate of the UK Trade Policy of Observatory. So welcome to you too, Anna. Thank you very much. What is the CPTPP? It's a fairly big piece of opportunity, if you like, and seen in some eyes. It's a big agreement. Some members account for 13% of global GDP, 15% of global trade, and the members have a population of around 500 million people. It is also a high-level agreement that not only reduces trade tariff for goods, but also sets new rules in areas such as services, investment, intellectual property, digital trade, and state-owned enterprises, amongst other things. Chatham House called it a union well-suited for this century. Well, today I hope that we'll have a really fulsome discussion where we expose just exactly what that opportunity would be for the UK and for our businesses. Graham, can I turn to you then by way and ask you to make some introductory remarks? We'll then go to Anna, and then we'll enter the conversation and come to the questions that we have starting to come in through the chat function. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Liam, and hi everyone. Thanks very much for being there. Yeah, my name is Graham Zebedee. I'm a trade negotiator in the Department for International Trade. So CPTPP, what a mouthful. It's a shame that it's not easy to pronounce, but what it's a high standards trade agreement. It covers Mexico, Chile, Canada, Peru, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei currently. That's about 13% of the world economy. That would be about 16% if we joined. The history of it was originally an Obama era idea of the US, pulled out of by President Trump. Remember him in his third day, I think, of office. And there's speculation about whether the US would one day want to rejoin, but that speculation is all it is, really. It's nothing like the EU. It doesn't purport to be any sort of replacement for the EU, for the UK, or anything like it. It doesn't have a court. It doesn't have a sort of permanent structure like the European Commission or anything of that kind. We did in DIT, we did a consultation about what people thought of it back in 2018, which was quite well responded to. We got although we would get a large number of sort of campaigning type responses when we do these consultations, but there was a broadly positive response to it. So we're moving forward to join it, if at all possible, right now. In February this year, we put out a notification of intent that we would start negotiations. I hope that before very long, we will see a formal invite from the CPTPP members to the UK to start negotiations, and that we'll be getting stuck into those formally again before too long. The exact timings are hard to say. The process of joining is 2 steps. Firstly, you've got to show that you can comply with all the rules. There's a little bit of flexibility that some members of CPTPP have shown around some of the rules, but by and large, you've got to take what's there. As my Japanese counterpart told me, it's a fixed menu, not a la carte, he said, which I thought was a good way of describing it. And then you've got to have a market access negotiation, basically talking about goods and services, procurement, access to each other's markets between the UK and all those other countries, such that we're satisfied with our access to their market and vice versa. And on that basis, and it's hard to know exactly when this might finish, we would join. Now, why do we want to do it? Because there's 3 different strands of reason for that. The first is the economic opportunities involved, which, if you're in business, is probably more immediately of interest to you than the other 2. So let me just do the other 2 first. So the second and third reasons are more long-term things, but I think also important. The first of those 2 is shaping the rules of world trade. So there are different entities that have a lot of influence over the kind of rules and regulations that countries have and that govern trade in the world. The EU is certainly an influential player. So is the US. China is increasingly important. And the CPTPP group of countries is also sort of a significant bloc. And by joining that, the UK would enhance its ability to be able to have more influence over those rules in future. The second is that of those other reasons, that it ties us into a really dynamic and important part of the world, more so than we are already, and that is to say the Indo-Pacific region, and I'm also the lead person within DIT for working up a trade agreement with India for my sins as well. So this is all part of an overall UK government push to connect ourselves in more closely to the region of the world which is growing and growing in power, both economic and political in the world. So in terms of those economic opportunities I mentioned, then it's worth noting that we already have trade agreements with some of the countries that I mentioned earlier, with Mexico, Chile, Canada, Peru, Japan, Singapore, and Vietnam. So, but those agreements are of different depths. So they're not all completely comprehensive trade agreements. The reason for that is that we have largely inherited them from the EU. We had to replicate the effects of them by 1st of January this year, which we largely did. But for example, the ones that we have with Mexico and Chile are and indeed Peru to an extent are quite old agreements. So by joining CPTPP, we really raised the kind of the bar, raise the standards in terms of our trade agreement coverage with those countries. Also, with 4 countries, the remaining 4, that I didn't mention just now, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia and Brunei, we don't have a trade agreement with them currently. We do hope to have one with Australia and New Zealand before very long, and we're negotiating hard with both of those countries. And indeed, there's been quite a lot of stuff about our trade agreement with Australia in the media just recently. With Malaysia and Brunei, we don't have anything. So in joining CPTPP, if they ratify it, then that would mean moving from what we call WTO terms, which is no preferential trade access to their markets, to quite a deep trade agreement and good access to those markets very quickly. So that's my daughter's just joined me. You'll see, and related to that, there's also there are also a number of countries who are interested in joining in future. So the Philippines, Indonesia, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and Colombia. I shouldn't call Taiwan a country. I'll call it an economy. Are of all expressed an interest in the past. There are also some speculation about the US rejoining one day, conceivably. But out of those countries, the UK only has a trade agreement in existence already with South Korea. So that would, if I remember my figures correctly, move the coverage, if the UK also joined, of world GDP for this agreement up to over 20%. So as you can see, that's a really significant, big agreement just there, and it would mean much better access to those markets. Indonesia, not a huge trade partner for the UK at the moment, but I guess I would encourage people to think about the long term. Some of these countries are really growing quite significantly, and in the longer term are going to represent much larger economies than they do now and be increasingly dominant in the world of trade. So that's why we'd want to do it. Why now? Well, partly for the reason that I just mentioned, which is that some other countries are considering joining. It's far better to be on the inside, scrutinizing other countries' membership applications, than to wait, have them join first, and for them to be scrutinizing ours. Also, why not? It wasn't possible to conclude trade agreements whilst we were a member of the EU. That's well known. But now, since 1st of January, we now are sort of fully able to do that. So there's no obvious reason to delay. As maybe I'll just conclude by saying, how can you, if you're interested in and supportive of this move, do please get in touch with us. You can reach me via the organisers of this seminar, this webinar. I'd be very happy to help give more information. And if you're on Twitter, you can look at DOT tweets and hopefully keep yourself informed by that means of our progress towards acceding to CPTPP.
Right. Thank you very much for that introduction, Graham. That's I'm sure most interesting for people, and I can see that we are got quite a number of questions that are flowing in to the Q&A. But before we come to those questions, I do want to come to Anna Jarewska and hear from Anna, just by way of maybe response and some opening remarks to get things moving.
Thank you very much, Liam. Thank you, Graham. CPTPP is a very interesting agreement. As Graham mentioned, it's a large agreement. It's a modern one. If you look at the background, if you look at how CPTPP was created back at the time when it was called the P4, before it was even called the TPP, all fantastic acronyms. It was created as, at the time, it was supposed to be one of the most advanced, if not the world's most advanced FTA in terms of provisions on digital commerce, on investment, on intellectual property, environmental and labor standards, and so on. So it is an advanced agreement, and some of that, some of the kind of the perhaps more strict provisions when it comes to something like intellectual property were removed when the US decided not to join. But a lot of the states, so it is as Graham pointed out, it's a high-level agreement. It's an interesting agreement. From my perspective, there are kind of two types of benefits when it comes to that agreement. And one that really has been mentioned quite a lot by the UK government, including Liz Truss, is the kind of strategic benefits or strategic benefits. And here we're talking more about geopolitical factors. And that's something that is incredibly important. In a way, joining the CPTPP is the UK's way of reassuring trading partners, saying Brexit wasn't about protectionism. We want to invest in global trade. We're here. We're going to be signing this agreement. We want to join, and this is a valid message to give. This is something that it's understandable that the UK wants to demonstrate that we're still part of the wider global trading framework. We just did not want to be in the EU. The shaping of the rules going forward is an interesting, and maybe it's something that we'll get into during the discussion. That's an interesting concept because on one hand, yes, the CPTPP is an existing agreement. So if the UK joins, it joins an existing agreement. And while it can negotiate its schedules, it can negotiate in terms of services, government procurement, and so on, there are certain things that as Graham mentioned, it's there. You're joining an existing agreement. In terms of shaping rules going forward, one question that I always have is, whether this FTA at the end of the day, because at the end of the day it is a trade deal, whether this is the ambition of the current members, whether it's still the ambition of the current members, whether it's going to evolve and shape the rules of global trade. But that's an interesting and open question. So in terms of traditional benefits, I think this is where my first point is that there are obviously traditional benefits in terms of market access and what being a member of such a large FTA can help to provide for UK businesses. But I think one important factor is perhaps not to overstate these traditional benefits to an extent where it creates a situation whereby we're raising expectations. On one hand, every FTA, and this is not something that's specific to the UK, but just in general, every FTA needs a little bit of hype. You need a bit of hype and excitement around an FTA to conclude that FTA, because chances are there will be some compromises. There always are. Again, nothing UK specific, you just always have some compromises. And in order to kind of help to sell these compromises, you do need to have some excitement around an FTA. And that's something that we've seen with every single FTA. And if you don't have excitement, if you don't have that hype, if people are more concerned about the possible downside of an FTA, like we had with CPTPP, with CEPA, with the EU-Canadian FTA, then the ratification, the conclusion of the FTA becomes more difficult. So you do need that hype around an FTA, and that's every FTA. However, at the same time, you don't want to overstate the benefits of an FTA in terms of market access, just for the very simple reason that you don't want to create don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. That's just the basic point. And in terms of the traditional benefits, we do have bilateral agreements, as Graham mentioned. The CPTP might be an opportunity to revisit some of these agreements. Other than these two new ones, might be an opportunity to deepen these agreements. But in some areas, perhaps not. It might be the other way around. It might be also an opportunity for these countries that we're negotiating with to revisit the agreements, the provisions that we agreed to, which may be a good thing or may not. And that's something to be careful about. One aspect that the UK TPO mentioned in one of its blogs is that with services, it might be much easier for the UK to get access, better access to the market of our trading partners through bilateral agreement, just because CPTPP includes so many exclusions and exceptions. So again, another point to bear in mind. And then just as a final point, and again, that's not really specific to CPTPP. That's the same for the UK, Australia, as it is for every single trade agreement signed by any other country. In a way, we tend to think about FTAs as an event, but FTAs are not just for Christmas. FTAs are for life. So one thing that I think would be incredibly important for the UK now that we can negotiate our own agreements and so on, is to really think of what it is that we want from these agreements, what we want to achieve, how we want it to match with our domestic policies, our domestic strategy, and what are our interests, and what we need to be careful in terms of kind of requests from the other side. How do we protect our farmers, our standards, our SMEs, and so on and so forth, which again is part of every single trade negotiations and analysis. So I hope there is still some time to kind of look at CPTPP, see what impact it would have, see what impact it would have on other negotiations, on our relationship with the EU, on our relationship with the US, what the future of the CPTPP might look like. It's also interesting, and that's a bit of a side point, but it's also interesting to think about the fact that CPTPP was initially created to potentially offset China's impact in the region, and China is one of the countries that has been kind of declaring and not declaring interest in joining. So that is also going to be an interesting development if China ever decides to join. So I'll stop here, but I think it's a very interesting agreement, but there's a lot to think about here.
It's like all agreements, Anna. They often start as being really interesting. It's actually how they play out in terms of both the negotiated position at the end of the time when the agreement is reached, and also the ability of all parties to animate these agreements so that they mean something for traders. Actually, I always think government reach trade agreements and traders actually bring them to life. So we have to bring all that together, of course, and make that happen. We've actually covered off in the introductory remarks some of the questions that are posed here, but I'm going to go to them anyway and see if we can flesh them out even a little bit more. But before I do that, I did want to come back to Graham. You talked about, this is CPTPP led by Obama, it's a sort of a Obama type trade agreement. And certainly some commentators see that as meaning that for a lot of the CPTPP in effect is an American style trade agreement. It has sort of the US written all through it. It's in its veins. We of course come from a position of EU style agreements and continuity agreements that are based on the EU agreement. I just wondered the degree to which that may create some difficulties in our extension to the CPTPP in terms of the a la carte menu not being available to us, but having been available to the existing parties, and that we're coming off a fixed menu that has got the US style agreement written through it. Do you see that as being a challenge or something? How do you approach that as a negotiator?
Yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, there are lots of challenges with all these things. That if it's none of this is easy. I guess what I'd say is that it's perfectly possible to have a deep trade agreement with the US and with the EU, and you look at Canada, and it does have both. I think it's largely because FTAs, even really high standards ones like this ones, they don't go so deep that you can't have arrangements with two blocks or countries that have kind of quite different regulatory models in some cases. But there will doubtless be some tricky issues here. And I just to take one of the questions, which I thought was a good one, about intellectual property, and Anna mentioned it as well. So there are certainly there are a lot of provisions in the intellectual property chapter is really a meaty one, and there are some provisions on patents in particular, but also copyright that were taken out when the US left, but there's plenty of serious ones still in there. And I guess all I would say, but when we'll publish documents about this, I hope within a month or so, and sort of go on the record about it. But sort of before then, all I would say is that we're not going to be doing anything which will undermine the UK's really world-class system of intellectual property protection and enforcement. So, and we're confident that's perfectly possible and perfectly sort of reconcilable with CPTPP.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, and thanks to Daniel Lenton for asking that question. Hopefully, we've answered it satisfactorily. But as Graham says, this is an opportunity, if you like, not just today but beyond today, to engage with DIT about the issues that you would want to see addressed. I'm going to go now to. I mentioned actually, Kieran Simpson. You did ask about do we think that the CPTPP would continue to expand and would. And I guess, Graham, you've talked to this point about others exceeding South Korea, Taiwan. Well, I think you had a different reference for it being a country, but nonetheless, Thailand and the Taiwan region. And would the UK support the expansion beyond those existing members to those other countries?
I think it would be a bit forward for me to sort of express any view on that. We're not in the club yet. So we should try and throw any weight around. But
do you see it as a club that ought to be thinking of expansion rather than contraction? And what would be the limitations? If China did want to accede to it and said it would follow all the rules, would that be fine as well?
Sure. Well, I mean, if countries, economies that can credibly show that they can follow all the rules, and there's good reason to think that they would comply with all the obligations that they would accept, and that they can, give very deep market access along the lines that current members have given each other. So about 95% of goods are traded between CPTPP countries are traded tariff-free. It's all about more than goods, I appreciate, but nevertheless. So, I'm not sure there's any sort of there's nothing in the rules to rule any economy out in principle.
In principle, and of course we've kind of been. I'm not saying we're backed into a corner on the Japan deal, but certainly, Japan has talked about we have to accept the rules, and you mentioned it. It's not an a la carte menu; it's a set menu. What is there in those circumstances to negotiate then? Where them's the rules. Are we just waiting on the invitation?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, if you were, on a quiet Friday evening, Liam, were to read all of the CPTPP documents, and I would look at the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade website as the best source for those. You'll see that a number of CPTPP countries have side letters between each other which disapply certain things. So if you look at that, you'll see that New Zealand, for example, disapplies the investor-state dispute settlement provisions with a number of countries. I'm not saying we would do that or we do anything like that, but that sort of mechanism, it does exist.
And it's important, Anna, isn't it, to understand the difference between being part of the single market in the European Union and this kind of, it's a very large trade agreement, but actually it's a layered agreement, isn't it? Can you talk to that a little bit in terms of, the nature of the agreement, this ability to have bilateral side letters in place?
Yes, well, I think if nothing else, the last 5 months have really demonstrated to UK traders what's the difference between being a member of a single market and having an FTA, what the difference is and what it looks like, and hopefully traders are getting, they're getting their head around what having an FTA looks like, and this would be very much as the same type of relationship in terms of movements of goods and in terms of kind of basic aspects of trade, meaning customs declarations, which we have right now, so it wouldn't be as much of a shock, rules of origin and so on. One interesting part, and obviously have to mention rules of origin here, one interesting benefit of joining CPTPP would be versus having the bilateral agreements with CPTPP members, is that we will be able to accumulate origin or add origin within the block, which could potentially be interesting for some of our industries. Wouldn't be a massive benefit for everyone, because that will very much depend on supply chains, but it would be an interesting benefit for some industries. One very often quoted benefit of the CPTPP is that it would help to shape supply chains, to help to integrate the UK within the supply chains of that region. And I think that's one of the things that I'll potentially have a question to Graham to see what he thinks the role of UK companies could be within these supply chains, because these are supply chains that first of all exist, second of all are potentially in a slightly different region. So how do we we're not going to be the manufacturing hub. Because we're not set up for it. We might be something else, but I'm very interested to see what that something else would be. So hopefully that answers your question, Liam.
Yeah.
That's
it's interesting, Anna, because actually in the origin provisions, there's actually the transportation of the goods in relation to that supply, the supply chain provisions. The rules actually say that if goods move between a member country and non-member countries, let's say for processing or for some kind of additions to be made, or they land in making their way to a member country, they land on other countries, that they can only continue to confer origin if the goods remain under customs control, which is a fairly onerous, it's one line, but it's a fairly onerous line when the proximity of the UK to the rest of the CPTPP member states is so vast, Graham. Are those the kinds of things that you would deal with in a side letter, or how do you deal with those kind of provisions where they are in effect supply chain limiting, and given that the rule is embedded there?
Yeah, thank you. I mean,
I may have taken it down a really technical rabbit hole that's inappropriate, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be brutally honest that those questions of customs control, I think Anna is better placed to talk about. Some supply chains which could particularly benefit from the CPTPP wide accumulation. And I know in some of our previous documents we've mentioned the possibility of car parts from Japan, being in UK exports to Mexico, just say, for example. Yep. So that could be something. It's also worth saying that we have the bilaterals that we have can contain accumulation with EU27 content and processing, and so we won't be losing that by being in CPTPP.
That's really important. That's really important to stress that, actually, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. There's a question related to I think some of the existing members, and maybe even, I'm not sure of whether this is dealt with in a side letter, but Bell asks, how realistic is it to think that the UK might be able to secure improvements on members' existing commitments? For example, Malaysia's current 16-year phase out for its tariff on Scotch whisky. Is that realistic, or is that something we have to live with?
Good question. The answer is nobody can really know that until we get stuck into a proper negotiation with them. They will undoubtedly start off by offering us what they've given to other CPTPP members. Can we go beyond that? I'd love to. I just can't know the answer to that question, though.
Not at this stage. Australia, of course, has been very much in the news, hasn't it? And actually, the murmurings on the Twitter sphere this afternoon are suggesting that your minister, Liz Truss, has succeeded in cabinet in having zero tariffs and zero, limitations on agri goods from Australia, and actually we set out our position with Australia. This, in parallel with the CPTPP, we've got this race to get a deal done by, I think, June with Australia. I guess one of the things that people are wondering, Graham, is the urgency that we're putting against getting a deal with Australia done, something we feel we need to get done quickly in order that we can move more readily towards CPTPP. I mean, their foreign minister is saying that unless you get a deal with Australia, we're a busted flush for CPTPP. So it's clearly being used as a negotiating kind of tactic. Are we going to dob in the farmers in order that we get those deals? I wonder.
Firstly, I'll just say that I remember a time when, cabinet discussions were confidential and you know about them. I do slightly reminisce about those times. But anyway,
I didn't think you were old enough, Graham.
I'm getting older all the time. All I would say is that the Australia deal has definitely got some momentum going for it at the moment. Between sometimes you have I sort of see it like there's a period of good weather when you're trying to get up Everest, and sometimes you think, right, we've got to seize that moment before that window of good weather closes. So I feel that there's a good window now to make progress with good on both sides. My Secretary of State is very clear that she's not going to get a bad deal at the expense of just to do it quickly. But if the window of opportunity is there, she's just definitely prepared to kind of go through it and maximize it, and maximize the progress that we can make. It's certainly right that it's certainly true that Australia and New Zealand, in their minds, CPTPP and the bilaterals are linked, and they wouldn't be serious trade negotiators if they didn't link things and look for points of leverage. That's what I'd say.
Okay.
If I can,
go on, Anna.
I was just thinking about the fact that this is a very good example of how every single trade deal negotiations, they come with their own difficulties. Because I remember back, I'm losing track of time, but a couple years ago, I don't even remember anymore, we had this notion that perhaps we'll sign a shallow trade agreement with Australia, and then we'll deepen it while we're concluding CPTPP. And now we're seeing that, both sides are taking every opportunity to negotiate a trade deal that, on one hand, protects the sensitive issues and the sensitive industries, and on the other hand, provides the kind of the maximum market access opportunities and so on for the exporters. So, I think this is a very good example of how tricky FTA deals are. Unless you're negotiating with Singapore, there's bound to be, which also can have some issues, but there's bound to be, difficulties. There's bound to be difficult aspects, sensitive industries, compromises, disputes, and the last minute, perhaps even bargaining cross sectors of, we'll give you that for that, and so on and so forth. And that's part of negotiations, and that's part of why trade deals take so long and are as difficult as they actually are.
I mean, we've kind of been asked to buy, aren't we, a kind of really long-term trade gain here. The government's own numbers show that on the existing membership of CPTPP, and given that we already have continuity agreements in place, that we're talking about, potentially about 1% more in services, about less than 1% more in goods. And so it probably does come down to those really long-term other people joining that we don't already have trade agreements with, kind of benefits, the Indonesias of this world, as you say, in Malaysia, Graham. Amy Bentham, thanks for your question. I guess it's about this parallel running of the Australian negotiations, New Zealand negotiations, and the timeline that you alluded to right at the outset. But she does ask, what do you think the length of time will be for each of the stages? So is it just a complete unknown, or is it, within the current year, do you expect to be invited, Graham? Do you expect to start negotiating this year, or is that something that's a 2022 thing?
Yeah, good question. So I'm hopeful. I would say, like, in the coming weeks, the parties, the CPTPP countries, might invite us to, sort of invite us to start negotiations. And if they did that within number of weeks, maybe sort of small number of months, we would actually start those negotiations. Firstly on the rules, and then secondly within the processes that within 30 days of starting a process on the rules, then you make an initial market access offer. Then the other country has to then reciprocate, and then you can sort of split off into a number of parallel bilateral negotiations along with a central one, and then you satisfy each of those countries and be satisfied by them in market access exchange terms, and then it all comes back together again for a decision point for the membership as a whole. Are we satisfied that the UK is, has kind of met all the standards and is going to be a real value add to the agreement? How long that might take is just very hard to know, partly because we're the first country to go through that process.
Yeah, we're at the vanguard here, and actually others might watch and from the sidelines that have ambition and see how it all goes for the UK. It's an incredibly intensive time, I'm sure, once you get into all of that. Robert Jackson does ask, though, is there a bottom line? Is there a red line beyond which the UK wouldn't or shouldn't go, Anna and Graham? And he's using the example of the press speculation. I should say that I was being a gossip and talking about what was on Twitter as gossip and not fact. I should also say that very recently a spokesman for DIT said any deal we sign with Australia will include protections for the agricultural industry and will not undercut UK farmers or compromise our high standards. So actually DIT has very recently, only 2 days ago, said the counter opposite to what is being speculated on today. But is there a bottom line? Is there a red line below which we should not go in protecting UK industry? Anna, go on, you start.
I mean, the benefit of being on the panel with Graham is that on questions like this, I mean,
you can just sidestep them.
I can't answer what the UK will do. Obviously, that's not in any way my area of expertise. What it shouldn't do, I think, there's a wider point here around the decisions what the UK wants to do. And yes, if you want to protect your agriculture sector, then you will need to be careful with certain provisions, not just within CPTPP negotiations, but also when you negotiate with the US. The same conversations some of the same conversations. We're so far not talking about chlorinated chicken when it comes to CPTPP, but some of the same issues, some of the same concerns around standards, level playing field for agriculture producers, protecting sensitive sectors, and so on. Some of the same conversations keep emerging whenever we talk about the US, whenever we talk about CPTPP. And to be honest, these are the types of conversations that most countries have around okay, we want to get market access and we want to be able to sell to that country, but they are likely to ask about some things that we're not potentially happy to provide, and that's a trade-off of FTAs and trade deals. You do need to be very clear, I think, with when you go into these negotiations, or what your red lines are, what the things that you cannot offer are. And you might not want to do this publicly, that's another conversation, but I think it would be incredibly helpful, and I hope that Graham's team has that awareness that there are certain things we don't want to concede on. But again, I can just talk high level. I think Graham is the best person to ask about what the UK's red lines are.
Yeah, I mean, it's more than agri, isn't it, Graham? I mean, there's things like labour provisions and intellectual property and, regulation and standards. A raft of things that you have to consider in these negotiations, and the agreements are extensive in the coverage of many of those points. So where's your red line?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that there are loads, so I mentioned, we don't do anything to stop us maintaining the really good system of IP protection that we have. We don't do anything that messes with the operation of the NHS, not just in raising the price of medicines, but in other aspects too. We don't, our food standards are set by us and not by our trade partners. We ensure that we can maintain the system of regulation for the audiovisual sector, not just the BBC, but more generally. We're not open on procurement. We're very open on procurement generally, but there's some things we decide not to be open on. That's sort of not up for grabs. We're careful about what we do on what we trade what's called Mode 4 or immigration. We're sensitive for the UK. Where we decide how we provide public services, not our trade partners. We don't go in for sort of, we decide what we privatize or make public. So there's quite a lot of stuff that is never up for grabs in trade agreements, and that I think increasingly that's sort of getting known to our partners, sort of in the same way that we know they're untouchables.
But there must also be provisions within the EU TCA that limit our, when we've agreed in areas such as intellectual property or some other provisions in terms of procurement or whatever, there'll be a range of things that are embedded that we've agreed within the TCA that surely make it kind of difficult or could create conflicts with other parties. Is that the case? I mean, it looks like it from the outside.
No, we absolutely would never sort of have conflicting international obligations. It's a really hallowed principle. So, a veritable army of government lawyers will, have crawled over every aspect. Compare it with every aspect of all agreements we've signed already, most notably the TCA, as you say. So we'll certainly not be entering into anything conflicting. Please be assured of that.
No, I'm sure people will be. I'm just picking off some of these themes from the questions that have been posed. One very quick one is: does net zero feature in these negotiations at all with in regard to CPTPP?
Yeah, I guess I'd say it does in two ways. Firstly, there's a really high standards environmental chapter in CPTPP, as Anna mentioned earlier. Talks about emissions reduction as part of it. So to our mind, it provides another, a valuable forum, the Environment Committee established under CPTPP to engage those parties. Of course, we're doing it through lots of other means as well, but another means by which we can talk to them about net zero. Where we have a lot of ambition, and then I would say on a sort of defensive perspective, the right to regulate, including the right to regulate to meet environmental commitments, is well established in the CPTPP text. So nothing in this agreement should stop us from doing what we need to do.
So to the degree, whilst going back to that a la carte set menu example or characterization, whilst there's a set menu, there's a degree of wiggle room, to use Nick Park's words from the Q&A. But is there a degree of wiggle room in terms of how you implement that set menu?
I wouldn't say very much. I mean,
no.
We're talking to countries about, so how have you interpreted this precise clause? Because Lord knows trade agreements are long enough as it is, and I do pity people who have to read the things. If they were to leave absolutely zero interpretation wriggle room, then they'd be sort of 4 times as long, and they'd probably be impossible. So there's always a little bit of flexibility, or interpretation scope in there. So yeah, but I think that's a feature of any trade agreement, not just this one.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that.
It's also partially where the kind of side agreements and side letters come in, is to kind of protect we were talking about the kind of conflicting international obligations, where you have a conflict with something else, to then use the side instruments to ask for a waiver or whatever you want to kind of call it, to kind of protect your international obligations, which many countries under the CPTPP have done so far. So it will be also one way for the UK to do the same if there is something that within the TCA or other agreements that conflicts with CPTPP.
Yeah, just to be clear, Graham, we can do that, can't we? Such as the examples you use with New Zealand and the agreements they've reached with other countries to set aside some of the provisions of the CPTPP.
Yeah, that's a thing that exists between parties. You're correct.
Yeah. So, in a sense, whilst the menu is fixed, the wiggle room is in a bilateral context, in the way that Anna's just described, and we've talked about previously with New Zealand, to a degree. To a degree. Yeah. Okay, so I guess that takes us full circle to why the bilateral agreements remain important, because I know that some people have talked about, well, why are we bothering to negotiate hard with Australia and New Zealand when we could just join the CPTPP and have them as trade partners anyway? But the reason is because we're thrashing out the bilaterals in the first place.
Yeah, partly. I would also say that FTAs you can put anything you like into them. I mean, you could have an innovation chapter, in a trade agreement. It's not in CPTPP, but you could add that in if you wanted to. And also, they're also kind of a bit more than just a trade thing. They're a sort of an expression of a strong political relationship between countries, and whatever the economic opportunities, countries who fundamentally don't like each other don't tend to do trade agreements with each other. So it has got a broader bilateral political resonance as well, and doubtless people are thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a case, isn't it, that whilst they're called trade agreements, they do tend to get nudged in a particular direction because of countries' geopolitical positions and the things that are important to them, and the protections that are built into those agreements tend to reflect that. In fact, Chris Brannigan, in his question, is talking about defence and security and saying, actually, is trade now more closely linked with a national strategy on things like defence and security than it was whilst we were EU members? I'm not sure it's any more. Wasn't it always?
Well, I would say it is now.
Point, Graham?
Sorry, I would say that it is now that trade policy is a UK competence, rather than EU one. We do have the opportunity that we didn't have before, to integrate things like trade agreements into an overall strategy on foreign policy. And we tried to express that in this document, the Integrated Review, which came out a couple of months ago, which people might have seen. That document talks, amongst other things, about the Indo-Pacific tilt, a sort of an increased focus on that region of the world, and cites CPTPP accession that we'd hope for, and indeed working towards a free trade agreement with India as aspects of that, along with an enhanced political and defence relationship.
Good. Well, look, I think that sounds like a good place for us to really conclude this discussion, that while CPTPP is about trade and we're concerned about trade, actually, it is about the UK having a much bigger foreign policy impact in that region, a region that is hugely dynamic and progressive. And we have to say hi to Graham's daughter there. She gets to wave to us all. That's great. Oh, we got very excited now. But nonetheless, in concluding the discussion today, I do want to thank Anna for her participation and her candour in this discussion, and the same to you, Graham. I think that oftentimes when we hear from ministers, we get the government view. And I'm sure we have got the government view here, but you've expressed it in a very conversational style. And I know that you remain open to hearing from people, and you're very keen to hear from people, not only in terms of CPTPP, but also the consultation recently opened, I think yesterday, on Mexico and Canada. And you can either do that engagement directly, or of course you can feed into the British Chamber's submission on those consultations by talking directly to your local chamber. So any final words, Graham and Anna?
No, only to say thanks very much. Thank you very much for mentioning the Mexico. Do please, I ought to have mentioned that. It's in my team as well. But do please fill that in. And thanks very much, everyone, for listening.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we've come to all the questions and answered all that were posed in some form or another. So thank you for today. Enjoy the rest of your day. And I'll look forward to our next webinar. For details, look on the BCC website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.